So there you go, recording in progress. The one from last month, if any of you missed it, the 1860s presentation, I do have a recording of that. So if you need it, I have it. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start our presentation. From the beginning. Come on, you. Wake up, machine. There it is. There it is. Okay. So hold on. I need to mute someone. Yes, there we go. Okay, so hi, I'm Kevin. This is Denver Through the Decades. We did 1858 through 1869 last month. So basically the 60s. And this month we are going to do the 70s as we continue marching along. So that's what we're up to today. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat window. I assure you from the fullness of my heart that there are plenty of things that I do not know, tons and tons. If you ask a question and I don't know what the answer is, I will get back to you after I do some research and find it. So don't be shy about asking questions. I don't mind being stumped because then I get to look up the answer. Okay, and a reminder, I know I said this last month, I am not covering everything that happened in the 1870s. There are many things I am not going to cover. I have been speaking with my colleagues, oh, but you should include this, you should include that. And I said after a while, I just have to stop putting things in. So I apologize if I don't cover your favorite part of the 1870s. I know you probably have one. So that's what we're doing today as we continue to march. So last month, we talked about how the earlier preferred nickname for Denver was the Queen City of the Prairie. For whatever reason, over time, folks ended up preferring the Queen City of the Plains, which is what we would become in the end. Today, it is a nickname that is not often used, but for those who know their history, you will see it occasionally in Denver, the Queen City of the Plains. So the 1870s, lots to cover. So let's get. And all right, let's see, just some notable things here. A few little larks from the 1870s. So the train reaches the city. This is monumentally important. I cannot stress the size of its importance at all. It is a gigantic piece of information. 1871, 1872, the first streetcar in Denver. For those of you who've traveled with me for a long time, you know that I'm a big fan of the streetcar history. People who are into trains and streetcars are absolutely passionate, and you don't argue with them. I had two huge giants in the world of Denver streetcars go head to head. The one said the first streetcar was December 1871. The other one said, no, it was January of 1872. And they were practically screaming at each other. So I'm going to let greater minds than mine work that out while I say the first streetcar was the winter of 1871-72. That way I don't run afoul of any of those folks. It was right in that area. 1873, Isabella Bird drops by for a visit. If you haven't read that book, we're going to talk about it in a little bit. 1870. Can you still hear me? Oh, damn it.
Yes, you're back on.
Okay, good. I think someone actually muted me accidentally. Okay, so 1876, all buildings had to be made of brick or stone. We're going to be talking a little bit about why that was. In fact, this Saturday, I'm giving a tour, part of which will focus on that history of why buildings are made of brick or stone in Denver for all those years. We had a big fire, as you may imagine. Speaking of stones, Riverside Cemetery was founded in 1876. And of course, 1876, another big year, statehood. We'll talk about that as well. The Argo smelter went in 1878. In general, over the course of the 1870s, water, sewer, telephone, all that good stuff would start to be put into place in that decade. Around Denver, some things nearby. Colorado Springs, an hour south of us, 1871, 1874, gold is actually surpassed by silver, which is important. Some people, of course, making their money off of silver. Highlands becomes a city. The big argument is it Highland or Highlands. Highland was 1859. It was between the river and Zuni. It was later absorbed into Denver. Highlands would come in 1875 west of Zuni. So it would later get absorbed into Denver. So Highland and Highlands were separated by Zuni at different times. 1877, dinosaurs. I know a lot of people are super into dinosaurs. A professor from the School of Mines, Mr. Lakes, was doing some digs over in what is today the area by Dinosaur Ridge, which is just to the east of Red Rocks Amphitheater. And he found some fossils, which would end up being known as Allosaurus and Stegosaurus, and were, and I wrote this down, the first evidence of dinosaurs, recognizable dinosaurs found in the world. So 1877, a pretty big year, especially when you think how popular dinosaurs are. P.T. Barnum got to Denver in 1878. We think of him only as being with the circus, but no, he decided he would get into real estate investment. He ended up later on creating the city of Barnum. Today it is the neighborhood of Barnum. So P.T. Barnum, great stories associated with him. There's an urban legend that he brought his elephants over winter here, and that's not so. 1879, Argo becomes a city. If any of you know the Denargo Market area, just to the northwest of that was the city of Argo. It would be right about where 38th and I-25 meet. So that area up there was the city of Argo. And Colfax was vice president from 1869 to 1873. He was part of the first Grant administration. He was not part of the second Grant administration because he was, while he was acquitted, he was accused of stealing money from the federal government during the Credit Mobilier scandal, and his political career was ruined. Locally, of course, Colfax is our main drag. So during this time, we, of course, would have been quite tickled to have our main street named for the Vice President of the United States. All right, so 1871. This map is available at the Library of Congress. If you look at the website down there, if any of you would like to look at this map more closely, it is one where you may zoom in really, really closely. Just shoot me an email and I will be able to send you this link. As you see down there, it's a giant email address or website. Just ask for me to send that to you, and then you may zoom in on a lot of this. What you're seeing here in the picture, you see the largest of the red rectangles there. That is the original land grant for Denver. So, of course, originally Denver was not supposed to be here. This was Native American land. The land grant was negotiated, generally stretching from the South Platte River on the west. Colfax was that dividing line on the south side over to Broadway and up. What you see in this map is other land grants, other plats, not land grants, I'm sorry, other plats that were put in where people have said, okay, I'm gonna make a housing area out of this spot. If you look at the map, you're going to see big ones and little ones. Some of these names you would recognize, most of them you would not. But this is sort of the extent of Denver planning in 1871. Many of these places, if you look at the bottom, X, B, all the way over to the ones at the far lower right-hand side, the one there just to the right, lower right of downtown, H, upper right-hand side, none of them actually existed. These were places where they had gotten the land. They said, we're going to build out these areas. They platted out the streets, but there wasn't anything really much in most of these areas at that time. So this is what is coming. And you get to see that juxtaposition with the downtown grid and the grid in the rest of the city. So again, if you'd like this website, let me know. I'm happy to send it off to you. Probably send me an email. It's the best way to do that. All right. So there's a great history written by Jerome Smiley. It was written at the beginning of the 1900s about Denver. If you don't have that book, it is literally this thick. It's a great read. If you read patiently, there's a lot in there. So a lot of this information I've got from Mr. Smiley's work. So he wrote this quote that you see here. So in the 1860s, we added about 10 people. So we started the 1870s with barely more than what we'd started the 1860s with. And that was because we were so far away and we were just not connected to the wider world. The city reflected that lack of access in the fact that there was just not a lot of growth. Now, this quote here, I'll read it out to you for those who might not be able to read it or might have your screens off or something. In 1871, 1,128 buildings of all kinds, one half of them less than 2 stories high, and but a few of them 3. Generally, those more recently built were of brick, but a large proportion of the dwellings were frame, and there were still many log structures surviving from the pioneer era. We had had a devastating fire in 1863, and the majority of our business district had been destroyed. So they had built up many of those from that. One of the things, of course, that we had to deal with was the fact that if you wanted to get to Denver prior to the train, what you see here in the picture on the left-hand side, that's how you would have gotten here. I suppose you could have walked or ridden your own horse, but otherwise you would have come by stagecoach. The Holiday Corporation that you see right there, Holiday was the gentleman who chose Denver for the the stagecoach, not Boulder, not Golden, not Littleton, not any of our other local rivals. So we named a street in his honor in downtown Denver. That's another story though. But the thing that really got it going, choo-choo, was the trains. Yeehaw. So June 22nd, 1870, the Denver Pacific rolls into town with the Kansas Pacific a couple months later. We talked last presentation about how the Union Pacific did bypass Denver, and Denver knew that the city would die without that. So we ended up having the big wigs in Denver spend their own money to get a spur up into the Cheyenne area, and that first train reached us. The conductor on that train was a gentleman named Billy Ogden. We were so excited to have the train that we actually named a street in Denver, Ogden, in that conductor's honor. Now, they did choose a street that was far, far out on the eastern side of town, far away from anything at all. Now, for those of you who know where Ogden is, of course, Ogden is in the absolute center of town, relatively speaking. But at the time, it was far away. But if you've ever wondered where Ogden got its name, it was named for that railroad conductor who brought that train into Denver from Cheyenne. So let's look a little bit more at the trains. So if you have not yet read the Encyclopedia of Western Railroad History, which is where I got this map, lots in there. I think it's a pretty good read. So if you look at the map, in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see Julesburg. That is the Union Pacific train, the first transcontinental railroad there. That was it. In 1869, that was the full extent of rail in Colorado. Well, in the end, as you see, we built one from Cheyenne south to Denver City, as it was often known at that time. And then later on in the summer, the Kansas Pacific would come. In the 1870s, we did build quite a few railroads, but this is what it looked like in 1870. So as you see, we have one up to Golden and one up to Boulder. Now, just to juxtapose this, I'm going to show you what we would end up doing by 1880. So this is 1870, and this is 1880. So this is how we end the decade. So the railroads came in, and of course, what they wanted to do was get into the mountains because that is where the metal was, that's where the money was. And yet there was a problem. Trains like flat. So there was a difficulty because the money and the reason you were in Colorado was up in the mountains, but it was hard to get into the mountains. The Secretary of the Interior said, this is 1867, the topography of this mountain region forbids the passage of this national thoroughfare directly through the mining regions of Colorado. And that is why it did bypass Denver. Now, as the trains come in and they start expanding all over the place. You see they're heading up into the mountains, coming to the coal fields and other areas, excuse me, hiccups, throughout the state. And we're just continuing to expand. The trains tended to prefer to make their own cities. So I wrote down a list of the cities that were created by the trains. The Denver and Rio Grande created as station stops, Castle Rock, Manitou Springs, Brighton, Evans, Pierce, Carr, Palmer Lake, all created by the trains. The Kansas Pacific created Strasburg, Lyman, Byers, and Cheyenne Wells. If you look down at the bottom of the map, you're going to see there it says Coke Ovens, and you're going to see just up from Coke Ovens, it says El Morro. El Morro was meant to be the town created by the trains that would kill Trinidad. In the end, this is one of the rare exceptions. Trinidad actually survived and El Morro did not. But most of the time when the trains went in, the train cities succeeded and the old cities gave up the ghost. So trains, 1870, at that point, the floodgates opened. It was absolutely cataclysmic. By the end of the decade, we had not even 5,000 people. It was just under 4,800 people. By the end of the decade, I wrote it down, over 35,000 people were in Denver. So the train made such a difference. All righty, where's my thing? There it is, okay. Now, let's go talk about the streetcars. In the late 1860s, an investor, Mr. Lewis Ellsworth from Chicago, came to Denver and he said, this town needs a streetcar. He went back to the investors he worked with in Chicago and they said, okay, no streetcar until they have a train. Otherwise, it's not a good investment. So they waited until a train came in and then they started to put in a streetcar. Now, this was how it started. 1872, you had a line that stretched from what is today the Auraria campus up to the 16th Street Mall, as it would be known today, and then up into the neighborhood that is today's Curtis Park. Now, Denver is unusual in that most American cities, housing would go in and then they would build the streetcar. In Denver, it was actually just the opposite. Literally, okay. Can you hear me? Okay, unfortunately, one of my co-hosts keeps muting me. I'm not sure why that's going on. Okay, so let's hope I don't get muted again. In most American cities, the streetcars went in after the housing. In Denver, it was the opposite. The housing would follow the streetcar. Literally, the companies would build out into the prairie and the streetcars would then follow. So Curtis Park, 5 Points, Whittier, which were initially white middle-class suburbs, were platted out because of the streetcar. Now, even though it goes beyond the 1870s, I just want to give you a taste of how the streetcar would expand in Denver. So this is that first streetcar line, 1882, 1892. Now, this was done by a gentleman at the University of Denver. You see his name there, Ryan Keeney. Down on the lower left-hand side, here is a website. Mr. Keeney put together the streetcars for Denver for their entire existence, from the winter of 1871-72 until their dismantling in 1950. This is an amazing resource. I just took 3 screen captures here. If you would like to explore the streetcar history, where they went, please just shoot me an email. I'd be happy to send you this link. This guy did all of this work. You really should go and have the fun of it, in my opinion. Okay, so again, all of this started with that. Curtis Park, our first streetcar suburb. And then you see expanding, finally getting up into the Highlands, the city of, and then of course, we're just going all higgledy-piggledy. So the streetcars were hugely important. People were able to get out of downtown, have their little house and their garden while commuting into downtown. It was a great game changer for Denver. It really dictated many of the growth patterns in Denver. And one of the things that is kind of forgotten is that this was very collaborative. the real estate developers and the streetcars worked together. They wanted to maximize their profit. So one of the folks at the time said, interurban electric, hold on, okay, interurban electric railway promoters and land developers had mutual economic interests and began to join forces, hustling a competitive market for riders and real estate sales. All right, we will come back to streetcars, but for now, I just want to point out a few fun things about the streetcars. This is, as I've said before, a subject that I adore. The streetcars in Denver were originally animal powered, as you see in the upper left-hand corner, mostly horses, some mules. Eventually, we would experiment with pretty much every method. Denver had cable cars. It totally had cable cars. We had electrified third rails. We had battery-powered cable cars. We really tried it all. Eventually, hold on a moment, there's a question. Okay. But what is the, okay, someone's just commenting on something to look up a little bit later. That'll be something for me to reply to in an email. If you want to shoot me one, we'll get you all set. Okay, eventually we settled on overhead electric. So if you look at the picture in the upper middle, that one is being powered by an overhead electric line. You see the one on the lower left-hand side and the one in the middle down at the bottom, all the same. So the picture, the lower left-hand side and the upper right-hand side, notice the sign on the front of the streetcar, goodbye, old friends. We got rid of all of our streetcars, a terrible, terrible day, June 3rd, 1950. I hope that is not the birthday for any of you, because at least for Denver history, that was a very, very sad day. Okay, so the streetcars, building out Denver. I know a lot about this subject. It's one that I find super duper interesting. There's another one that I find very interesting because I like to drink water, and that of course is water. Now, one of the things we talked about in the last presentation was that initial ditch coming into downtown Denver. Actually not coming to downtown Denver, excuse me. It went to Capitol Hill so that Henry Brown could get rich. So that was a pretty sweet thing for him. The ditch that you see in the lower right-hand side there, that is the city ditch, which runs through Washington Park. So there's a question, why did Denver do the streetcars first rather than like other cities? So most other cities in the United States, they had already expanded outward and the technology of streetcars came later. Out in the West, we were a new city, relatively speaking, so we still had a lot of untamed land with no one on it. So since we had the space to fill, we filled it. And that is where the streetcars come in. They were put out first because there wasn't a city already there. Think about Baltimore or Boston. Those places were already well expanded. So they had to fill in after the fact. Okay, so the city ditch that you see there on the lower right-hand side, if you look at the picture, the upper right-hand side, although this particular picture is not from the 1870s, it does show work on modifications to the city ditch as the city developed. Here in the lower left-hand side, this is a screen capture showing where the city ditch goes through everyone's favorite park, well, almost everyone's favorite park in the city, and that's Washington Park. And there you have a picture of Mr. James Archer. Mr. Archer was one of those folks who knew that with water, you could do amazing things in the city. He was bound and determined to get us some clean water. So he joined up with some other folks, David Moffett, etc. And in the early 1870s, they created the Denver City Water Company. Wanted to make sure I got the name right there. And this was charged with the effort to get you clean water. One of the things that they did was build a percolation well about 100 feet deep near the South Platte River. And then they would allow that water to percolate through the sand and such to clean it so that you could have clean water. So Mr. Archer there, we have a water station in Denver named after him. But those early efforts in Denver began in the 1870s. And Mr. Archer, Mr. Moffett, those were some of the folks associated with those early efforts. So I wrote down some numbers here. Okay, at the time in the early 1870s, there were about 4 miles of water mains through the city. When you think about how much water we have today, that's absolutely stunning. So Louisa Ward Arps, the famous historian, did comment about the water and how important it was to the city from her youth. We had ditches flowing all over the place. Another quote from Jerome Smiley. Archer Street is named after him. Yes, it is. One of the things Jerome Smiley said, immediately following the arrival of the ditch and all of the laterals that extended off it, tree planting and lawn making in every direction, in every residence and in every district, bringing a great bounty of green, which changed the city's appearance forever. So this really an important moment. So the city of Denver did take control of the ditch in 1875. The ditch itself was completed in 1867, but the city acquired it there in the 1870s. Okay, now I hope you have all read this book, wonderful book. Isabella Bird was a British traveler who came to Colorado in the 1870s, and she really had nothing good to say about the cities along the Front Range. All of them, Fort Collins, Greeley, Denver, she really had nothing complimentary to say. She called Denver the great braggart city. I wrote down a couple of her choice quotes here. She was in Colorado for about 2 years, 1871 to 73. Of Denver, she wrote, "It is a busy place, the entrepot and distributing point for an immense district, with good shops, some factories, fair hotels, and the usual deformities and refinements of civilization. Peltry shops abound, and the sportsman, hunter, miner, teamster, and immigrant may be completely rigged out in 50 different stores." She talked also about how it was a place full of men. There were very few women. And when the men got money, they immediately spent it in what she called the maddest dissipation. It was a savage place and nothing that she particularly liked. If you know your history for Miss Bird, you know that where she really fell in love was up in the mountains. She went up into what is today's Estes Park. She climbed Long's Peak in that outfit, by the way. I mean, she would have had a traveling attire, but you see her there with the horse. That's from a newspaper drawing. She would have worn a dress and such to climb up Long's Peak, but she did it. She really liked the area around Estes Park. And was Bird's book published as a book or as a serial in a woman's magazine or something similar? Oh, good gracious. I've always known it as a book, but it is possible that it was published as a serial first. I will say I thought it was a book. So that might be something that will bear a little more examination from me if you'd like me to look that up for you. Oh, yes. So she wrote about her experience when she got back to England. And according to some of the historians of the time, Miss Bird's writing really can be credited with seriously increasing the amount of tourism to the Rocky Mountains. There is a direct corollary between her writing about Colorado from her visit 1871 to 73, and a lot of people coming to see what she had described. England, of course, well tamed by this time, Wales, Scotland, all of it. So folks came out here to see the wild, wild West. Okay, now Denver is being built by the train. Well, what's happening then is Denver is building the mountain towns. You've got gold and silver up there in abundance, but they still require all of the things to build them up. Jerome Smiley wrote, "Leadville turned to Denver unceasingly for supplies as the mining camp mushroomed into a booming city. In meeting all demands, the commerce of Denver was greatly increased and the merchants enriched. More than any other town, Denver profited by Leadville's wealth. So it was with almost all of the mountain towns. Fortunes made in one place were spent in another, and that other place was almost always Denver. So here you have Central City, Black Hawk, Georgetown, Leadville, all of these places where folks were going up and living in these ramshackle mountain towns. Well, they needed supplies, they needed a place to spend money on whatever it might be, all that wild dissipation that Isabella Bird talked about, and Denver was the place that did that. So once we got access to the trains, all of these places could spend their money in Denver. So building the mountain towns also built us. And this is important because all that money went to building things in Denver. Some of the things that went in at this time, you got breweries, pickle factories, which is good because I love pickles, mills for flour, paper mills, ice houses, machine works, and all these things began to burgeon out in the 1870s. Okay, and of course, all of this is also building Denver. So for those of you who've taken the history tours up in the Central City, Black Hawk area, you may remember that the smelting that was done to process the ore so that you could get all that great metal out of it, the smelting happened up in the mountains because that's where the mills were. Well, the mountain ravines are like these, and it's hard to have a really big smelter in a ravine. Now today, Black Hawk is in the process of removing the mountains, but in the olden days, it was like this. So you could only get to a point. Well, one of the folks up there, Nathaniel Hill, who made a giant amount of money, which is why we have the Hill Mansion in Denver. In the end, what he decided he wanted to do was recreate the smelting in Black Hawk with his Argo mine down in Denver. So Nathaniel Hill came down to Denver and he created what you see here, the Argo smelter. Waves of immigrants then came in to feed those smelters. In general, the waves of immigrants coming to the smelters were in sort of three. The first wave tended to be Cornish, Welsh, and Scandinavian. The second wave was mostly Irish and Italian. The third wave was mostly Austrian, Polish, and Germanic Russians. Mr. Hill made tons of money, which is why we know his son Crawford Hill and the Hill Mansion in Denver. Smelting in the mountains came down to the prairie, and it was located in the northern part of Denver. So in the 1870s, that happened. Now, the city seal that you see here on the right-hand side indicates how important smelting was to creating Denver. The smokestack that you see there in the seal for the city of Denver is the smokestack from the Globe smelter, which I believe was the largest of the smelters. The smelter was eventually removed, and that smokestack came down in 1951, I believe it was. But the power and the money that smelting provided to the city of Denver was so great, it actually features in our city seal there. A lot of you may never have seen the seal, but that is the smokestack for the Globe smelter. So in the 1870s, in northern Denver, right there at the border with Adams County, we put up those smelters. So another thing that came out at this time, of course, parks and plots. So I mentioned earlier that Riverside Cemetery would go in. Riverside Cemetery was meant to be a beautiful park-like cemetery. The monument that you see there in the lower left-hand side, that is a statue from that cemetery. The upper left-hand side, we put our light rail tracks. That is a train track, by the way, but it was a good picture, so I chose it. We put our train tracks out into places. The first park in the city of Denver was Curtis Park. As you see from this screen capture from Google Earth, it is now called Mestizo Curtis Park, but that was the first park in Denver. And in the end, we needed more parks. So the city actually had one of its representatives, not the city, the state, had one of its representatives, Jerome Chafee, petition Congress, the United States Congress, to give us some land. And they did give us some land. It was going to be called Congress Park. While they were waiting to make it a park, they made it a cemetery. That might be a story you know. That's today's Cheeseman Park, and Congress Park was moved elsewhere. Later on, of course, Mayor Spear would put in his parkways, but in the 1870s, we got our first parkway. 1874 is when Park Avenue went through. So we started to green up the city and to bury our dead. Okay, now before there was a Capitol, there was no Capitol Hill. We had an area for the rich, and that, believe it or not, was 14th Street. For those of you who've done the Elegance tour with me, we've talked about this before. 14th Street today, 2 blocks off 16th, of course. If you know where the Denver Center for the Performing Arts is, where the wonderful Blue Bear is, which of course we all know is the second best piece of art in the state of Colorado, 14th Street was Ritchie Row. And that is because that is where former Territorial Governor John Evans put his house, and all of the other Ritchies of the time would have followed. Here you see in the lower left-hand side, the Steck Mansion. Mr. Amos Steck was part of getting education going in early Denver. The original Hill Mansion was there. Many mansions would have been along 14th Street. If you look at the picture on the right-hand side, by the way, that building that you see there with the dome is not the Capitol. That is the Arapahoe County Courthouse, which this picture is actually not from the 1870s, but I put the picture in here because the housing that you see here in the foreground, that is from the 1870s, and it shows you this house, this beautiful Second Empire house that you have in the foreground here, that is from the 1870s, and it's right there on 14th Street. So it shows you what we have built in our original Ritchie Row. Now, eventually, all of those mansions would be torn down. In fact, the only Victorian building in downtown Denver from the 1800s is the Chukovich Mansion, which is across from Woomob there at 14th and Court. But this is where we did have all the well-to-do once upon a time, 14th Street. Okay, now another thing, Henry Brown, as we mentioned in the last presentation, he had the land east of Broadway, stretching from about 10th up to about 20th. And at the time, it was out in the middle of nowhere. He was so certain it was going to make something, though, that he ended up building a house. So he built it, and it was really sort of the only thing east of Broadway. It was an undeveloped prairie. As one of the sayings at the time was, Brown lived, quote, out in the country. But Henry Brown, remember, he donated the land for the territorial capital. That was part one. Part two, he brought water to his land so that people would want to live there with the water. Part three, he made a smart decision. He ended up selling this house to the Tabors. And once the Tabors were there, more people wanted to be near the Tabors. So the change for Capitol Hill started to come in earnest after he sold that house to the Tabors in the late 1870s. I think 1879, yes, 1879, he sold it to the Tabors. So this house, by the way, no longer stands, of course. If you know where the Mile High Center is, this would be just across the street from the Brown Palace Hotel, basically. But for a while, that was where the Tabors lived. And before that, of course, Henry Brown lived there. Now, one of the things we talked about from the 1860s, William Newton Byers promoted the city. He was a booster, an absolutely shameless booster. He was not above lying, perfectly happy to lie, in fact, if it would promote the city of Denver. Now, in 1866, they built the News Block, which is the building you see there on the right-hand side. That is because, if you remember from our last presentation, in 1864, the Rocky Mountain News, along with a bunch of other things, were washed away. All those things were washed away in a flood on the Cherry Creek area. Well, he rebuilt, along with some other things you see listed there. And from 1866 to 1887, they were in the News Block. Within the decade we're covering tonight, 1870, the Rocky Mountain News became a morning paper. And interestingly enough, 1878, William Loveland bought the paper. This is important because Loveland had been one of those people pushing for Golden to be the capital. Byers was one of the ones pushing for Denver to be the capital. So there was some acrimony between the two men. But after almost 20 years in business, 1878, Byers was able to sell, and Mr. Loveland took it over and did modernize the Rocky Mountain News. So this newspaper, begun in 1859, had some changes in the 1870s. And there you see Mr. Byers on the right-hand side, or on the left-hand side, excuse me. Okie dokie. So Denver school number 1. We have never been a particularly creative city, and this is part of that. If you look, you're going to have in the foreground the river, that's the South Platte River. We are from over where Little Man Ice Cream is in this picture. We are looking off toward the northeast. That prominent building you see with the steeple there, sort of in the middle upper right, maybe, that is Denver school number 1. It's amazing to see the skyline here because the entirety of Northwest Denver, of course, does not exist. My house in the Whittier neighborhood, nada, nothing there. So this is Denver when the school was created. I have lots of pictures of this school, and it is a fascinating story. Today, we tend to forget that free education was not always a thing. In Denver, it was a pretty difficult discussion. In the early 1860s, we did create 2 school districts. On the east side of Cherry Creek, we created the East School District. On the west side of Cherry Creek, I bet you can guess, they created the West School District. Those would end up joining up in 1862. And then William Byers, whom we just saw the slide before, said, nothing may more conduce our continued prosperity and growth as a city than to add to our reputation than free institutions of learning. Many folks were very pro, a lot of folks were not. One of the discussions was whether or not we should integrate the schools. So it was something we were debating. Eventually it did happen, and they decided they would plat out and create a school. This picture shows the laying of the cornerstone. I have some pieces from the article. This was June 1872. There was a lot of excitement. People were so excited. As you see, they turned out in droves. They had a parade. They had a big ceremony where they had the ceremonial first turn of the shovel, all that great stuff. And the Rocky Mountain News reported, the procession probably contained no fewer than 2,000 people, while the number of spectators who thronged the streets could not have been under 6,000 people. So it took a little while to build. This was the the cornerstone laying, and eventually we got a beautiful school. So it opened in 1873. Now the custom at the time was to name a street, or excuse me, was to name a school after the street where it was found. So this was the Arapahoe School. Dora Moore Elementary was originally called the Corona School. Whittier Elementary is the opposite, that came later. So we have several schools in Denver that got their names from the streets. The problem with this one, and I'm sorry, but this is true, when they call it the Arapahoe School, people thought it was a school for Native Americans, and they didn't want to go there because they didn't want to go to school with Native Americans. Now, let me rephrase that. Some people didn't want to go to school there because they didn't want to be in school with Native Americans. Some folks knew that that was not the case and had no problem. But in the end, there was some consternation over this. So in the end, what they ended up doing was simply calling it Denver School Number 1, or they just called it Number 1. This was the entire school system. Kindergarten didn't really exist. First through senior, this was all in this school. Now over time, as the population swells, we do start moving out the grades. And so this school ends up becoming something else. Oh, I found these in here when I was doing my research. I thought I'd just put them in here for fun. So let's go back a slide. So the cupola in this building, the next 2 pictures are taken from that cupola. So this picture is looking toward the southeast. So of course, what do you see not there? The Capitol is not there. Capitol Hill is not there. A whole bunch of things not there. But we're looking off toward the southeast, toward what would be the Capitol and Capitol Hill. This picture is looking toward the northeast. The house that you see there in the foreground, that is the home of a well-respected businessman at the time, George Tritch. For those of you who did the ghost signs tour with me, we talked a lot about George Tritch. He ended up the owner of that house I showed you a few minutes ago where the Tabors lived, and he had the unhappy duty later on of kicking the Tabors out of that house after they lost their fortune. That'll be a story for the 1890s. But this house that you see in the foreground is the Tritch home. And as you see, northeast Denver, yeah, just not much there. All right. In the end, what they would do as the school became less needed, first they moved out the high schoolers, then they moved out all of the kids, and this building was built. So this is the club building. Oh, what's the architect's name? Frank Edbrook, there it is. Frank Edbrook built this. Now look at the picture on the right. Do you see back behind the building? There's a little bit of a roof there. That is the school. The school became a rear annex for this building, literally blocking it out almost completely from view. So our Denver School #1 would become nothing more than an add-on. Here is a view, a rare view, in fact, this was hard to find. That building that you see there on the right-hand side that there's no glass in any of the windows, that is the school. The larger building that's on the other side of it, that was the club building. And unfortunately, all of those buildings were torn down, both of them. So there's really nothing left. Let's see if I wrote down the year, 1955. They tore the school and the club building down in 1955 as part of parking for the Federal Reserve Branch Bank and other things in downtown Denver. So later on, the Skyline Urban Renewal Park would go in. So Denver School #1 is now part of what is part of the Skyline Park. So the 1870s, some things were coming. Now, I have read multiple history books that basically say this when it comes to racism in Denver. In the 1850s and 60s, it was such a struggle to survive that we basically needed everyone. If you were here, we needed you, your hands, to survive. That included everyone of every race or religion. Well, as one of the historians wrote later on, in the 1870s, we started to become a little more like the East, so we could start putting on airs. So the city became more racist. In Denver, the Chinese population did grow during this decade. Anti-Chinese sentiment also began to grow during this decade. It's a very sad thing. So I wrote down one of the quotes here from the newspaper. Here in Denver's Chinatown are the opium houses, the gambling halls, and worse places still, which make the lowest and meanest spots to be found in the city. The newspaper further says that we must beware the wily heathen who will put all of our laborers out of work and drive our women into prostitution. So the 1870s, we saw tensions beginning to rise. Now, nothing burst into fighting yet, but tensions were beginning to rise in the 1870s. Okay, one of the folks who came to Denver and made his fortune was Mr. Mullen that you see here, one of those wonderful rags to riches stories. Mr. Mullen was an Irish immigrant who came to Denver, and he came to the West. He got rich because he was smart and hardworking. Among many things that he was able to create, one of them was his Hungarian high altitude flour, designed so that bakers would not have to make adjustments for high altitude. The flour mill that you see on the lower right-hand side, that is one of the flour mills that went up there during the 1870s. And he became an industrial magnate and gave tons of money over the rest of his life. His house that you see there on the upper right-hand side went up in that time and is, it's gone, but it would have stood on what is today the Auraria campus. So J.K. Mullen made our cakes rise. and suds made some spirits rise. Now, of course, we have been making beer in Denver ever since the 1850s. In the 1860s, we really got serious. So I do want to tell you a very sad story about the Tivoli. Now, there was a fellow, Mr. Moritz Siggi, who was a German immigrant. I'm sorry, not German, Swiss immigrant into Denver. And what he did was buy a brewery, and then he enlarged it. And then later on, he was the owner of the Tivoli brewery that you see here. No, I was correct the first time, German immigrant. I shouldn't doubt myself. He created a special type of beer, his Bock beer, also sometimes called his Buck beer. Now, folks loved his recipe so much, they begged him to write it down so that they could reproduce it. And Mr. Siggi said, when I am old, I will share the recipe. Unfortunately, he did not get to do that because he was in a carriage accident on March 22nd, 1874, and died. I think he was in his 40s at that time, and died of his wounds. So of his injuries, excuse me. So his famous Bock beer recipe went with him. So perhaps the most famous beer of the 1800s was lost to us for all time there in 1874. So a really sad thing. Now, speaking of the Auraria campus, where the Tivoli is, some of our buildings in the 9th Street Historic Park went in at that time. The buildings that you see there on the left-hand side, some of you, if you grew up in Denver and have been here for a long time, you might even remember these, because the building on the far left there, that was a very famous restaurant. That's the Smedley House, was built by a doctor and dentist back in 1872. It was the first of the houses built in what is today the 9th Street Historic Park. Later on, in 1947, it would become the Casa Mayan Mexican restaurant, among the first Mexican restaurants in the city. And it was wildly popular. Many of the people I have spoken to who grew up in Denver, 50s and 60s and such, they remember going to the Casa Mayan. Unfortunately, it did close in 1973. The red brick building that you see right there, that is the Roop House. That was built in 1875. It was a home for a gentleman who came out with his family, and he got into the cattle business. Today, the 9th Street Historic Park features houses from the 1870s to the early 1900s. If you haven't been, it shows you what this area was like when it was residential. The building on the right is the Emmanuel Gallery, also built there in the 1870s as an Episcopal church. Another story from this time period is Mr. Barney Ford. Barney Ford was a slave, and he was able to earn his freedom. He moved west. He became Denver's first Black millionaire. He was on the social registry. He actually had several restaurants, the most famous of which, his People's Restaurant, is still standing. They're at 1514 Blake, I think it is. Yes, 1514 Blake, although it's no longer called the People's Restaurant. He sold his restaurants, and he built, among other things, this beautiful Inter-Ocean Hotel that you see here. To juxtapose that, this hotel was located at 16th and Blake. This is what that intersection looks like today. So the Inter-Ocean Hotel was torn down in 1973. The building that you see there, of course, is quite new. It replaces what I think was an office depot, I think. But sadly, that Inter-Ocean Hotel, the American Hotel, lots of things in downtown Denver lost. Mr. Barney Ford was hurt financially by the crash of 1873. He did move to Breckenridge, where he basically got his millions back again by getting into mining and other things there. So if you haven't been to the Barney Ford Museum in Breckenridge, you should go. He is honored in stained glass in the state capitol. So Barney Ford, our first Black millionaire and the first Black person to be on our social register. Last presentation in January, we talked about the Tabors, how they got to Colorado and moved up to the mountains. By this time, they are in Leadville. In 1878, Horace Tabor became the rich man he had wanted to be. The Little Pittsburgh mine was worth millions of dollars, 10 million plus, in return for about $54 that he had given to grubstake the miners. After that was the chrysolite, excuse me, and then of course the famous matchless. Now he ended the 1870s super duper rich, living off the mantra, silver will always be king. We shall see. Okay, of course, a seminal moment in the state's history, August 1st, 1876, we become a state. This is a work, Admission of Colorado to the Union, by the painter Joseph Hitchens. It shows Madam Columbia or Lady Columbia there on the right, welcoming Miss Colorado to the Union. She will walk through that triumphal arch there, and she will become one of the sisters of the states. Important men there behind her. So President Grant signed the admittance of Colorado to the Union, and that is why today, still August 1st, is Colorado Day. Now, not everyone thought that was a great idea. If you read the quote there in the upper left-hand side, this is from a newspaper on the East Coast, excuse me. There is not a single good reason for the admission of Colorado. Indeed, if it were not for the mines in that mountainous and forbidding region, there would be no population there at all. The population, such as it is made up of a roving and unsettled horde of adventurers who have no settled homes there or elsewhere, and are there solely because the state of semi-barbarism prevalent in that wild country suits their vagrant habits. There is something repulsive in the idea that a few handfuls of miners and reckless bushwhackers should have the same representation in the Senate as Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York. I love reading that quote. One of the things that we don't often remember is that our Colorado State Constitution was written in English, German, and Spanish. So you see that there on the right-hand side. Okay, our state's constitution was written in a bank. You see it here in the picture on the left-hand side there. So that building, unfortunately, after it became Constitution Hall, was burned by an arsonist in the 1970s. The picture that you see on the right-hand side there, that wall, that kind of disreputable looking wall there, is all that's left of the location where our state constitution was written. So again, the building on the left would be burned. The picture on the right where you see the white truck and the silver SUV, that would be inside that building when it was standing. So that is where our Constitution was written. Henry Brown. Now, if you look at the map, he had that that area through the Homestead Act where you see the letter H. In the late 1860s, he donated 10 acres of his land to serve as the territorial capital. So unfortunately, he was mad because the state seemed not to be building on the site. So he tried to take it back. He tried to take back his land because we weren't using it. So in the end, it actually went to the courts, and they decided that Henry Brown could not take back his land. So in the 1870s, 1876, we got the territorial capital. We got to be the state capital. I cannot speak English. We became a state. It actually wouldn't go to a vote of the citizens until 1881 to confirm that Denver was the capital. During that time, of course, Henry Brown was trying to take back the land, but he was unsuccessful. So that's why we still have the capital there. Okay, so if you have any questions, please type them into the chat window. The clock says 6:59 here. So please type them into the chat window here. I do want to let you know we have some upcoming tours where we still have some space. We'd love to fill them so that we get to run them. Natural New Mexico in May. That one, people see the word hiking, but it's really not that bad. You see a picture of Bandelier National Monument here in the left-hand side. We're going to go there. Birding the Southwest. You see some bird pictures from previous tours there. And of course, we're doing the digs out at Amachi. We're not doing the digging, but that's in June and beginning of July. Thank you for the kind words. So if any of you have any questions, please type them in here. I will hope to see you on a future tour. You're always welcome to shoot out a question to me. Where is the location of the bank where the Constitution was written? That is located at 15th and Blake, I believe. No, hold on. I'm doubting myself. 15th and Blake. Market, sorry, doubting myself. 15th and Market. Current use of the Tivoli building. It is the student union for the 3 campus institutions, MSU, UCD, and Metro. And CCD. All are using that as their student union. They do still make beer in there though. So any other questions, please shout out. Otherwise, I'll let you sign off as you need to. Thank you for joining for the 1870s. I'll see you next month for the 1880s.
Thanks, Kevin.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin.
You're very welcome. All righty, I don't see any other questions coming in. If any of you need me to send you a brochure, I'd be happy to do that. I will answer any questions. Just email me and we'll get you all set. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Stay warm and good night. Oh, when was East High downtown built? 1873, I believe it was, that it opened. And that was the Arapahoe School. Remember, it was the Arapahoe School originally. And that went up 1873. What? Okay,
Great,
any other
thank
questions?
you.
Let me know. You're
Good
welcome.
info. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.
You
Stay
as well.
warm.